Hello and welcome to Worlds Apart. One of the largest ethnic groups without a state, Kurds have long been both the victims and the active participants of large geopolitical ventures. And as the Middle East goes through one of the biggest upheavals in its recent history, can the Kurds turn this power struggle into a benefit for their cause? Well, to discuss that, I'm now joined by Hemin Hawramy, a high-ranking member of the Kurdistan Democratic Party. Thank you very much for your time,
welcome.
sir. I know that Kurdish folklore has very rich tradition, and one of the characters we most often encounter in Kurdish tales or songs is that one of a fox. And it's interesting that that animal is often praised for its shrewdness and cunningness, but also, his tendency of overplaying his smarts lands him in a rather precarious situation sometimes. And I think this is very characteristic of Kurdish approach to politics in general, but it doesn't seem to further your own cause that much. I wonder, why is that in your view?
First, the Kurdish questions in the Middle East has been the victim of the lack of democracy, lack of peaceful coexistence, lack of the non-acceptance of the others and the rights of the others. So because the Kurds in the Middle East, we are not Arabs, we are not Turks, we are not Parsis. We are a different national group, and we have our rights in that area. So as I said, we are the largest nation in the world without a state. And we are realistic. We have been divided into four countries without the acceptance and the askings of our people. And now we understand these realities of four countries, and each part of Kurdistan within the countries that we are living in has its own peculiarities. So we don't want to copy-paste what we have in Iraqi Kurdistan to the other part. We do believe that this is the time for accepting the Kurds as they are, and to live in a democratic situation that they can have a guarantee of their constitutional rights in their own countries.
Absolutely, and I think this is the argument that various Kurdish political parties have been making probably for decades. But if we look at your most recent history, it seems that any substantial change in the Kurdish question occurred only at a time of major geopolitical upheavals. For example, if we take Iraq, the autonomy that you have there wouldn't have been so strong and so successful if it wasn't for the American invasion and the American support. In Syria, if we look at some of the concessions that both the Assad government and the opposition promised to the Kurds, it's only because they want to have them on their side. So it seems that it's not so much about peaceful dialogue and negotiations with the authorities, but rather any kind of change for you can come through major political cataclysms.
I don't agree with that Kurdistan's autonomy has been strong because of the US invasion. Kurdistan has been enjoying its autonomy, its federal region since 1991 after the uprising.
But I think you cannot really argue that the United States put a lot of resources into strengthening the autonomy of Kurdistan. Having this region secure and safe and burgeoning is in the interest of the United States. And
again, United States did a very important thing by removing Saddam from power. We acknowledge that, and without the US support, the Iraqis could have not removed Saddam from power. But again, the Kurdistan region, its stability, its security, it has not been because of the US presence. But definitely removing Saddam from power, having a new political era in Iraq, and having a new system in Iraq that Kurds are trying to be part of, has led to more strength of Kurdistan as regions and to have more resources. But also Kurdistan add a lot of weight to the new Iraq that we have after 2003.
Now, you mentioned a lot of persecution that your people faced in Iraq and many other countries. And I think one possible reason for that is because many of those governments in Turkey, in Iraq under Saddam Hussein, maybe even in Syria, always saw the Kurds as a sort of a Trojan horse that could be used by their enemies for their own political gains. I wonder if you believe that Kurds are still being used as a bargaining chip in the larger Middle Eastern politics, especially today.
That era is over. You know, Kurds have not been the Trojan horse, as you mentioned, but Kurds, they were the victims of the totalitarian system that we had in those countries that we have been living in. As I said in my earlier speech, the Kurdish issue is the issue of a nation that has its own language, culture, history, background, and that's it. But that has not been recognized by the respective countries. So in this geopolitical game, if they disagree on anything, they have agreed on limiting the Kurdish rights in their own countries. And that was the results of the Sykes-Picot agreements. But that era is over. Kurds are no longer be that weak point to be played with by these countries, and Kurds now an actor in the region that they have their own agenda.
But I wonder if this active role that you just mentioned is a result of very difficult political circumstances that those respective governments find themselves in, because Turkey has a lot of security issues. Syria as well has a lot of security issues. So there may be an immediate political advantage to keeping the Kurds at bay or keeping them placated.
Kurds, especially the Iraqi Kurdistan as an example, prove that they are part of enhancing democracy in the Middle East by having elections, by having pluralism, the rights of the women and the rights of voting for all the components of the society, and by having the quota for all the other minorities that we have inside Kurdistan regions, by having the peaceful handover of the power, and also by the free of the press. All of that help for having Kurdistan as a beacon of democracy in the Middle East.
But the problem is, of course, that the democratic prospects around the Middle East are not ensured. In Syria, for example, even in Turkey, you don't know whether democracy will continue to flourish.
That's why we say that Kurdistan region prove that if Kurds will be allowed to have that chance, they are part of the positive, they are part of the solution, they are not part of the problem. Because if we have a better understanding, if we respect each other, if we accept each other, and if we don't deny the rights of the existence of each other, then we have a better understanding to go forward.
Now, one thing we can certainly agree on is that the Iraqi Kurdistan is the closest Kurds got to self-determination, but this prospect of, or this model of autonomy is very unlikely in other countries with big Kurdish populations, whether we are talking about Turkey, even Syria, Iran, for example. Yeah. Do you see that model of autonomy as more of an exception or a rule?
As I said, we don't have a formula of copy-paste what we have in Iraqi Kurdistan in other parts of Kurdistan, because every country has its own peculiarities. The Kurdish question, for example, the Kurdish question in Turkey, the Kurdish question in Syria, the Kurdish question in Iran, and the system, the democracy that we have in Turkey, and or in Iran or in Syria, and the way that the government is looking at the Kurdish question is different.
Okay, let's look at some specific examples. First of all, Turkey, the country with the largest Kurdish population, where 20% of citizens are of Kurdish origin, and for decades they couldn't speak their language freely, they couldn't practice their culture proudly. Now, most recently, the Erdogan government reversed that policy of cultural assimilation. But I wonder if you think that those measures that he has taken so far would be enough to settle the Kurdish question in Turkey, because he's not willing to discuss not only the issue of autonomy, he's reluctant to discuss even broader participation of Kurds in municipal government, something that you would expect in any democratic government with such a large minority.
Kurds, as you mentioned, it's the largest part of Kurdistan. Kurds in the Kurdistan, we call it the northern Kurdistan, which is part of Turkey. These Kurdish people, they have been denied of their existence. They have been denied of their studying in their mother tongue language. They have been denied even of, they have been recognized as the mountain Turks, as you know, in the last century. But now what Prime Minister Erdogan did, we do consider this is a courageous step that Prime Minister Erdogan AK Party did in terms of the Kurdish question. First time in Diyarbakir in 2005, when Prime Minister Erdogan said the era of denying the Kurds is over for us, this was like a start point. Concerning the recent measurements and the packages that the Erdogan's government announced, we do believe that it has not included all what we as the Kurds expected, even the Kurds in Turkey. But we do believe also that these are first steps in the right direction. So we welcome that package that Prime Minister Erdogan has, because if you compare measuring from where the Kurds were and how the government in Turkey was dealing with the Kurds from where we are right now, we do believe this is a positive start, and we have to support this positive start, because having the ceasefire and ending the bloodshed, the military solution, the security perspective by the respective Turkish governments prove that it's a failed perspective.
I think it's a rather contentious issue that the era of military struggle is over, especially if you look at what is happening in Syria. But before we go there, I would like to ask you one more.
Turkey, the military situation in Turkey, for the Kurdish question in Turkey.
Well, speaking about military struggle in Turkey, if we look at the polls, Turkish polls, we will see that more and more Turks actually welcome giving Kurdish people, their social, their cultural, maybe not so much electoral rights, but there is one sticking point very important sticking point about between the Turks and the Kurds in Turkey, and that is their attitudes on the fate of Abdullah Öcalan. And the majority of Turks believe that his prison conditions, and he's been held in solitary confinement for a number of years already, shouldn't be improved.
Yes.
Kurds, on the other hand, the overwhelming majority of them believe that this absolutely has to be changed. How crucial do you think the Öcalan issue will be to the success of this ongoing settlement process?
First of all, you know, the Kurdish question in Turkey is not only the question of the PKK and Öcalan. The Kurdish question has been there even before the establishment of the PKK and the Öcalan. So the government in Turkey should have a strategy for the Kurdish question, even if it is separate from having a strategy on how to deal with the PKK and Öcalan. But definitely PKK and Öcalan, they are an important part in finding any kind of a permanent solution for the Kurdish question inside Turkey. So in that regard, we do believe that Öcalan can play a very crucial role in taming in the PKK to be a positive partner for the peace process. And we do believe that all partners, Turkish government, the PKK and the Öcalan, and those whoever wants to have peace in Turkey, whatever is needed, whatever is useful, it must be used in order to achieve this permanent peace and to end the bloodsheds and the tears of the mothers of the Turkish and the Kurdish people. But that's why, in that regard, we do believe that Abdullah Öcalan is in prison. The condition must be improved, and also the level of having a dialogue with him to raise to the negotiation. If it can be achieved something through Öcalan, why not? Let's try it.
And very, very quickly before we go to break, one country that has a very large Kurdish population that we very, very rarely hear about is Iran, despite the fact that they have, I think, the world's second largest Kurdish community. And what's interesting about this country is that Kurds in Iran seem to be content regardless of who is in power. Even under the democratic government, they were pretty happy. Under the Shah rule, they were also pretty happy. Even under the theocratic government, their rights and their freedoms seem to be larger than in some other countries. I wonder, what do you think is Iran doing right to make Kurds so content? Because the issue of Kurdish nationalism or separatism never gained any traction in Iran.
The Kurds in Iran, it's a different case. I don't agree with that argument to say that the Kurds were happy through under the rule of Shah or the current Islamic Republic of Iran, because the Kurds have been denied of having educations, for example, in their mother tongue. The Kurdish is not allowed to be educated in the schools. Yes. The Kurdish is not allowed to be educated.
As far as I know, it is freely practiced, and there are even Kurdish
but it's not allowed
deputies
in the schools.
In parliament.
It's not allowed in the schools. It's all in Persian. The studies in the education system.
But at least they are better represented in the electoral system and in the society.
But again, you know, the Kurds in Iran also, they have, as a different ethnic group or as a nation in Iran, they have been not recognized in their geographical areas. So that's why the Kurds in Iran also, they have similar cases of the denial. It's true that only one province is in Iran, it's called Kurdistan, which is the Sanandaj, is the capital of it. But again, the same paradigm of the problem is there as well. It is the lack of recognizing the Kurds as a different national group. And because Kurds in Iran, Kurds in Turkey, we in Iraq, we have not asked for the changing of the borders. The Kurds in Iran also are not asking for the change of the borders of Iran, and they can act positively if there will be more willingness from the Iranian side, from the Iranian government, to recognize the Kurds there.
Mr. Hawramy, we have to take a very short break now, but when we come back, Syria accounts for less than 10% of the global Kurdish population, but doesn't it hold the keys to deciding Kurdish question once and for all? That's coming up in a few moments on Worlds Apart. Welcome back to Worlds Apart, where we are discussing the Kurdish issue with Hemin Hawramy, one of the high-ranking members of the Kurdistan Democratic Party. Mr. Hawramy, let's turn our attention to Syria now. Yes. I visited some Kurdish communities in Syria last year in Aleppo, and there was a lot of excitement there because for the first time in many decades, those people could speak their language freely. They could open Kurdish schools. They were in charge of their municipal affairs. They had their own security. And it seemed that, for the first time, they really had this independence and self-rule that they coveted for so many years. And yet, one of the recent news that some of the political fractions in Syria declared autonomy, when they declared autonomy in the region of Rojava, the head of your own party and Kurdistan region president Masoud Barzani was very, very critical of that. If Kurds in Iraq could have the autonomy or self-rule, why not the Kurds in Syria?
President Masoud Barzani and the Kurdistan region has helped the Kurds in Syria, because we do believe that this is an important issue for us. The question is not that we are not supporting the Kurds to have their own rights, whether it's a federalism, whether it's autonomous or whatever they agree. But we do support that when we have a political agreement, a political solution that is based, that is recognized by the other partners in the Syrian questions, and also it will be recognized by the international community. We don't believe that any unilateral move that has not any constitutional background or legal background or democratic agreements background is going to serve. And also, if you look at that unilateral decision that the PYD has made, it does not have the support of the other important partners within the Kurds inside Syria.
But isn't it the case that getting international community to agree on anything on Syria has been pretty much impossible?
I don't mean the international community. For example, we are in the process of going to Geneva II, for example, and we do believe that the Kurdish delegation must be one delegation, and it must have a clear vision of what the Kurds in Syria want. What the Kurds in Syria want must have, it must be through this dialogue with the Syrian government, for example. The PYD, the question for the PYD is that this unilateral action, does they have any agreement with the Syrian regime? Does it have any background that it can be survived with any change in the development in Syria?
Actually, Mr. Barzani, as far as I know, did accuse the Kurdish Democratic Union Party of siding with the Assad regime, something that
it's not accusing, it's apparent, you know, the PYD.
They denied it at least, but at the same time, Mr. Barzani...
I have a question for you. If they denied, for example, on the ground, on the reality, I want you... Russia Today itself made a program on how the Qamishlo airport is being protected by the Syrian army and by the PYD. If it's not a side, what is that?
Protecting your own community, protecting infrastructure...
With a Syrian soldier?
Within your country doesn't mean siding with the Assad regime. They're protecting their own land.
Why the Syrian regime is not allowing the other armed groups also to protect the community?
I have a question for you. Mr. Barzani, despite criticizing them for siding with the Assad regime, and we can argue whether it is legitimate or not, but Mr. Barzani himself had no qualms about associating himself with Recep Tayyip Erdogan, a leader who openly supports the militarized Syrian opposition. So it seems that Kurds, various political parties within the larger Kurdish community, are really losing what was their strength for a long time, and that is they're no longer above the fray as they always used to be. Their eyes are no longer fixed on their ultimate cause. They are parts of all those various alliances, it seems.
If you allow me just to answer that question in a bit details, you know, first, the President Barzani's strategy and Kurdistan region strategy for the Kurds in Syria, we don't intervene, we don't dictate what they should want and they should not want. Our advice for the Syrian Kurds, based on our experience in Iraqi Kurdistan, that the Syrian Kurds, they should not side with any, whether it's the Free Syrian Army, whether it's the tools of the other regional countries, or whether it is with the Syrian regime. The Syrian Kurds must have their own agenda, and that agenda, that's why President Barzani invited all the Syrian Kurds. If you go back, on July 11, 2012, President Barzani supervised an agreement, which is called the Erbil's Agreement, between PYD and the other Syrian Kurds to establish the Supreme Boards of the Kurds to lead the Kurdish question inside Syria. Our strategy is that, and President Barzani, if the Kurds in Syria are going to decide to fight the regime, this decision must be unitedly taken by all the Kurds. If they are going to negotiate with the regime, apart from the Syrian opposition, this decision also, again, and the delegation must be included by the Syrian Kurds. If the Syrian Kurds are going to join the national opposition in Syria as a group, also this decision must be unitedly taken by all the Kurdish group. But our strategy, we have tried our best to unify the Kurds and to avoid the Kurdish fighting, because it's not the interest of the Kurdish question.
Mr. Hawramy, I take your point. You're calling for Kurdish unity, which you absolutely have to do. But the question is, of course, that the conditions for Kurds in all those different countries are very, very different. And again, Mr. Barzani, you both accused some of the Syrian Kurds of fighting what is not a Kurdish fight. This is essentially what you just said. Yeah. And that was in a reference to some of the clashes between Kurdish militia and Al-Qaeda forces earlier this year. But what does it actually mean? I mean, if you have those terror groups operating in your area, if they threaten your women and children...
They were not in their area. I like to check that information.
Well, they were in their country at least. I mean, Kurds in Syria still believe that Syria is their country, isn't it?
The Kurds suffered from the terrorism a lot. We recently suffered from an Erbil. We suffered a terrorist attack by Al-Qaeda that they came from Syria. We are against terrorism. But that war, if that war is against terrorism, we ask PYD that they should allow the other Kurdish parties to join them together to fight terrorism. It's not a question that we are not with fighting the terrorism. We will fight terrorism wherever they are. But we do believe that this decision, that the Kurdish decision to fight terrorism, to fight the others, must be unitedly to have the others also to be in that fighting. But the PYD is not allowing any other Kurdish parties to be active in the Syrian Kurdistan, whether in fighting the terrorists or in fighting with the regime or in fighting with the other opposition groups.
So essentially what you are arguing for is that Kurds should put their ethnic identity above their national identity. Let me ask you a personal question.
Yes.
Are you a Kurd first or an Iraqi first?
I am a Kurd first, of course.
But
I am a Kurd first. You know, is it a crime to be a Kurd first?
It's not a crime, it's your choice, but you can't demand that from all the people.
I am from Halabja. I have been bombarded. You know, I still remember the smell of the chemical weapons. So what Iraqi identity brought to me? Iraqi identity brought to me the killings of people, mass graves, 4,500 villages were destroyed. But after 2003, we have a new Iraq. I can say that, yes, I am a new Iraqi Kurd. But this new Iraq must be based on that constitution that we have.
I think this stance of us versus them, us Kurds versus them Iraqis, is very perilous, and I don't think it has a big chance to lead to any sort of reconciliation.
It's not. If you look at the history, Kurds after 2003, there is the main rivalry among the Sunnis and the Shiites. You know that it's a very known fact. But have you heard in any political move that the Kurds sided with the Sunnis against the Shiites or sided with the Shiites against the Sunnis? No. The Kurds has been always trying to bring in both sides and not to side with any side. It would have been very easy for us to side with one side and to win over the other side, but we don't do that because that's not our problem. We want this new Iraq after Saddam to be an Iraq for all of us, not Iraq for the Sunnis, because the era of ruling Iraq, like Saddam did and the other Sunni partners did, one-man show, one party, one ethnic group, or one party, it's over. Iraq
and yet there should be just one Kurdish position no matter what. Kurds are not allowed to have different sorts of opinions, regardless on where they live and what kind of circumstances they face, and whether or not they're entitled to fighting Al-Qaeda in their own backyard or not.
But we're talking about Iraq, because this Iraq is...
No, but I mean, you claim that you cannot rule with an iron fist any longer in Iraq, but
yes.
you claim that you have to have an absolute unity when it comes to the Kurdish question, even though Kurdish realities in Turkey, in Iraq, in Syria are very, very different.
I said, when I said the Kurdish unity, I am not claiming the pan-Kurdistan as unity, because every country has its own peculiarities. When I say the Kurds in Syria, for example, Kurds in Syria, we have more than 30 political parties. If every political party is putting their party agenda above the Kurdish agenda, then the Kurds are not going to achieve anything in Syria.
It seems that all that political struggle undermined what used to be the strength of the Kurdish politics, of Kurdish people, the ability to come together, to keep neutrality and to keep their eyes on their main goal. And some experts are now suggesting that, this Kurdish cause, as we know it for many decades, is nothing more than just a very convenient political slogan. Do you think there is such a thing as Kurdish issue at all? Hasn't it outlived itself? Is there still this
Kurdish
unified dream for Kurds in all those different countries?
If you ask me whether the Kurds want to have an independent state, definitely. Every single Kurd has this dream. It's internationally recognized as part of the self-determination according to all the pacts that we have internationally for the rights of the nation. But again, we as the Kurds, in Iraqi Kurdistan, in Syrian Kurdistan, in Turkish Kurdistan, Iranian Kurdistan, a strategy of having a pan-Kurdistan from all of these four is not on the agenda. But again, the borders of the Middle East are changing so rapidly. If the borders are not going to be changed, the internal borders of these borders and the meaning of the borders are going to be changed. But if you ask me how the Kurds want to achieve their self-determination rights, our strategy is not armed struggle. It must be through peace, it must be through democracy, it must be through political recognition, because let me be frank with you, any forced division is not going to survive for good.
Since you mentioned the upheaval that the Middle East was going through, one of the most pressing issues is, of course, Syria these days,
Yes.
and the population of Kurds in Syria is not that significant. Around 2, maybe 3 million Kurds live in Syria, but Syria is, of course, a very important geopolitical juncture for all those surrounding countries with very large Kurdish populations. How crucial do you think is the outcome of struggle for Syria for the overall Kurdish cause?
It's very, very important, and the Syrian developments, we look at it very, very closely, because it's going to affect the Kurdish question, it's going to affect the Sunni-Shiite relations in the Middle East, it's going to affect the security issues in Iraq, and it's going to affect the political situation in Iraq, in Turkey, and everywhere, and for the entire of the Middle East.
Very, very quickly, you already mentioned that Kurds in Syria have no reason to like the Assad regime, and many of them had difficulties getting citizenship or, speaking that language. So absolutely no love lost there. But do you think Kurds will benefit if the Syrian opposition, particularly the most radical factions of
Definitely
it, will take?
No. The Kurds,
power in Iraq, in Syria rather.
We don't believe that, because, to be honest with you, neither the Syrian regime nor the opposition, whether it's radical or moderate, they don't have a clear vision for what they have for future Syria. They all want to change, then to talk later. The Kurds are accustomed with this game. We are not going again to be the victims of this game. There must be a clear vision, whether it's by a regime or whether by the opposition.
Mr. Hawramy, this is all we have time for. Unfortunately, we have to leave it here, but I appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
If you like the show, please join us again, same place, same time, here on Worlds Apart.